over 1 million innocent people were killed, 1 million human beings erased from the earth because of the so-called war on terror. Now, over 6,000 US soldiers have been killed in these wars. Tens of thousands have come home maimed in wheelchairs. Hundreds of thousands have come home with severe psychological trauma, actually leading to an epidemic of suicides where veterans who are out of the military kill themselves at a rate of 18 per day, and that within the active duty ranks of the military, there are more soldiers who are killing themselves than are being killed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. So while the US government had wanted us to really cheer and applaud this, symbolic death of one person, what has the US government given us over the past 10 years? How many people have died in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen? And how many US soldiers have come home in coffins? And of course there's this, this great fanfare over killing this terrorist, right? Well, which terrorist was it that killed over 1 million Iraqis in their homes? Which terrorist was it that just last month killed 9 Afghan children from an Apache helicopter, shooting them one by one as they were gathering firewood? And I think we can rightfully say it's great that a terrorist has left, but the war on terror is terrorism. It is terrorism for millions of people living in Afghanistan, living in Iraq, living in Pakistan, and living in all of these countries that the United States hopes to dominate. And the number of people who have been killed, the number of people who are suffering, does not even compare to one speck of the suffering inflicted by so-called terrorists. Now, I want to say that, the discussion about the conflict, as they call it, in Israel and Palestine, of course, is one that we have to resort to events like this to get the truth out, right? Not even to get the truth out, but to have any kind of discourse whatsoever about this topic. Because, it's something that is completely left out of public discourse. We don't learn about it in school. The US media, of course, is not a source of information for coverage on this topic. And in fact, I think looking at the lessons of the Iraq War show the US media, all mainstream media, to be nothing more than a mouthpiece for the Pentagon, echoing the same lines that come from the Department of Defense. And I think we can see that very clearly when you look at, in 2002 and 2003, in the lead up to the Iraq War, well, the majority of people in the United States were against the invasion of Iraq. That the intelligence, the so-called reasons for why we had to invade were very obviously fabricated, were very obviously concocted and now proven to be these blatant and willful lies by the US government. And while the United States was preparing to send thousands of young men and women who joined the military, who took an oath to do what they were told, to follow orders, when the US government was preparing to send them to their deaths, when they're preparing to carpet bomb the oldest cities on the planet, the birth of civilization, there is not one questioning voice in the US media. Not one questioning of the intelligence. Not one questioning of why we should accept the possible death of thousands of soldiers and thousands of civilians, which turned out to be well over 1 million. And in fact, not only were there no voices, but those dissenting voices were eliminated from the mainstream media. Someone like Phil Donahue, who had the highest rated news show on cable television, had one guest who questioned the rationale for the Iraq War, and his show was canceled. A writer, Chris Hedges, who wrote for the New York Times, began writing articles questioning the rationale for the war, and he was fired. I mean, this kind of exposes that if you're looking to the US media for any kind of clear perspective on what's going on in the world, you'll just be getting exactly what the politicians in Washington and the billionaires that sit above them want us to hear. And that's why we say in March Forward, in this organization of veterans and many active duty soldiers as well, that we don't just want Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney indicted for war crimes, but we want the CEOs of those news companies who propagated those lies that are just as responsible for the death and destruction, not just in the military, but of the people in those occupied countries. So let's send the CEO of GE and NBC and CNN to jail as well. But, you know, of course there's all this corporate media telling us why we had to go fight and die in Afghanistan. And as I said earlier, I was a member of the US Army. I actually, was not at all a leftist when I joined the US Army. I joined because I wanted to serve my country. I joined because I believed in US foreign policy. I believed that the US military was a force for good in the world. And I believed this so much that I was willing to die for those ideals. I volunteered to go to Iraq because I thought we would be defending our friends and family here at home, and that we'd be giving a better life to the Iraqi people. So I'm coming from this perspective, my perspective today, as someone who was on the opposite side of things, who supported the war, who supported Zionism, who supported the acts of the US military and the US government around the world. But, there was no corporate media in Iraq to tell us what was right and what was wrong and why we should be there. There is only the reality of the war. There is only the blood of civilians, the screaming families that we dragged from their home in the middle of the night. There is only the hands turning purple from handcuffs we put on. There is only men crying in detention facilities as they were interrogated, as they were tortured. And the reality of the war, the firsthand experience of the war, is what showed me and so many others that there is no possible way that this was a war for liberation, that it was a war to free the Iraqi people, or that it was a war to defend our friends and family here in the United States. It was something else. It was something very, very different. And we learned what it was very quickly when our unit, invading that country in 2003, initial task was to immediately protect the oil fields in the north of the country. And those slogans of no blood for oil began to hit a chord just in the first month or so of that occupation. But it was being there as a soldier in March of 2003 as a part of the initial invasion, occupying that country for a year, that, I began to look at the Iraqi people and, begin to think that these families, these young children like my sister's age, my brother's age, these parents that reminded me of my parents, that they weren't so much different than me, and that these families weren't so much different than my family. And then I realized that not only were they not so much different, but they were no different. And I had absolutely everything in common with these people, and that putting myself in their shoes, if my town had been bombed from the sky, if my home had had its door kicked down in the middle of the night, my family dragged from their beds, my siblings thrown onto the street, my father thrown away to a detention facility never to be seen again, if my friends were shot when they were walking down the street, that probably I would be fighting too. And that those who were fighting, those who were resisting, had the absolute right to do so. They had the absolute right to resist the foreign invasion, the illegal occupation, and really one of the atrocities of the modern era, which was the war in Iraq. And I began to think, looking at my fellow soldiers, why did we join the military in the first place? Not everyone who joined for the same reasons I did, of this, real desire to serve my country. And actually, when I got to basic training, all the drill sergeants, they asked everyone, why did you join the Army? And when I said I joined to serve my country, they all kind of laughed at me. I was like, well, isn't this why everyone's here? And then hearing responses from the other soldiers, it was almost unanimous that the response was, I couldn't afford to go to college, or I couldn't find a job, or I have a family and I need health care for my family, or I was homeless living in my car with my children and I needed a place to live. This is why the vast majority of people join the US military. But who sends us to war? You know, who is making the case that we had to occupy and invade Iraq? Was it other people like us? Was it other people who need to go to college? Is it people who are suffering from unemployment? Actually, no. It was a bunch of millionaire politicians who dine at five-star steakhouses with these billionaire shareholders in these oil giants and these defense contractors, those who have made billions of dollars in profits off of the wars. Those are the ones who send these young kids who can't afford to go college to go die. And who are we fighting in Iraq? You know, things became clear when, we were capturing people who were carrying out attacks on US forces, and I found out that they were kindergarten teachers and doctors and lawyers, regular professions, factory workers, farmers. And so this question was, going here thinking that we were fighting terrorists, but why is this kindergarten teacher shooting at me? And it made us think, who is responsible for our hardship in the first place? Who's responsible for us not being able to go to college or not being able to find a job? It was those same people who told us we had to fight and die in Iraq. And so there's this understanding that thousands of people in the military have come to, that our enemy is not poor people in Iraq, is not poor people in Afghanistan, but those billionaires and millionaires who will throw our lives away just to make a profit, and we should be fighting them instead of fighting other people who are just like us abroad. So, I'm not the only one. My experience wasn't unique, and in fact, many of us who had been through a similar experience, other veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, of Vietnam, and other conflicts the U.S. has been involved in, we joined together to form the organization March Forward. You can go to marchforward.org to read articles and follow our work. And actually, getting onto the topic of Palestine, we formed during Operation Cast Lead, as called the Gaza War, of course, which was not a war at all, which was a massacre. And we formed because many of us had traveled to Washington, D.C. to organize a demonstration against the massacre, which actually ended up being a demonstration of over about 60,000 people. It was a massive demonstration, a massive show of support and solidarity for the people of Palestine. And many of us were there organizing with the Answer Coalition and realized that a lot of us are veterans and maybe we have something here. And so our first action of this organization was in the streets defending Palestine, marching shoulder to shoulder with tens of thousands of others, denouncing this criminal siege. But not just because it in itself was an atrocity, which of course it was, and really exposed to the world, the true nature of the Israeli settler state and of U.S. support for this regime. But there was more of a connection than just it being an atrocity in and of itself. Now, in 2002, when Israel reinvaded the West Bank, when there was the historic massacre in Jenin, when the Palestinian people heroically fought back, there was a demonstration in D.C. as well. Actually, a demonstration of over 100,000 people in support of Palestine, which was the largest demonstration in U.S. history in support of the Palestinian people. And the slogan of this demonstration at this time was, "Free Palestine, no war on Iraq." And this was the slogan at the demonstration, was connecting these two issues. And this was making the point that there is no possible way to understand U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine without understanding it in its broader